Welcome to all.
Well, thank you, Susan, and good morning, everybody. This presentation, I know the last one I did was in February, and we talked about Alice. And really, my notes from that presentation, my initial thought was to do this debt presentation. And it's even more imperative, I think, that we at least talk about some of the issues that are out there, particularly with the bailout incentives, the $2.4 trillion government bailout, and what that all means. But what I want to do is I'm going to back up. I had a script of some things I wanted to say. This is way back in February. This was about the time of the Democratic debates. And so that's where I'm going to start, and then I'll move forward and we'll talk about some of the issues that I see that a lot of isn't being addressed, partially due to the pandemic, but certainly needs to be addressed during this presidential election and our senatorial elections, so candidates can answer your questions if this information brings some of that stuff to the forefront for you. So back in 2014, 72% of US voters agreed that the federal deficit reduction should be the #1 issue for the president. 72%. In 2019, just last year, as the federal deficit surpassed, this is just a yearly deficit, surpassed $1 trillion, only 48% of the population felt that way. So with the expanding federal debt, huge yearly deficits, only 48%, less than the majority of the people felt that, oh, this was an issue. Now, 54% of Republicans felt it was an issue, but only 44% of the Democrats. And when I read that information, that got my interest up about the overall issue. And there, in 2016, President Trump, he indicated that his policies were going to create fabulous economic growth, and he would eliminate the $19 trillion federal debt. Again, $19 trillion federal debt very quickly, like within 8 years. And that's his quote, very quickly, like within 8 years. So the last 10 years, we've had $2 trillion in tax cuts and $2 trillion in spending increases. And even though we've had, up until this year, decent economic growth, the federal deficits have grown over 40% year over year. And that's with full employment, no recession, low interest rates, and no financial crisis up until this year. So the current debt, our current debt is, I'm going to show this if you can see it. No, it's kind of backwards, darn it. Anyway, it's $26 trillion. Now that is one huge number, which means that our interest payment is $1 billion a day. $1 billion a day. It's an issue. That $26 trillion that is our current federal debt was expanded by the $2.4 trillion bailout package. But in the last 4 years, we've added $4 trillion, even when times were good, because government has decided to spend more than we're taking in tax revenues. That to me is a problem. Now, the interesting thing is somebody said, well, how are we going to pay for this $2.4 trillion incentive that the government, and they're looking at another incentive package to get us through this pandemic crisis and the economic crisis. Well, by issuing bonds and by the Treasury borrowing money. Now, in this case, in the current case of paying for the 2.4 trillion, the Treasury didn't put out public bonds for you and I to buy. They did it by borrowing from entitlement trust funds. And so it was pretty much just print money. It's an internal borrowing, not public borrowing, because at some point in time, that internal borrowing becomes external borrowing. So the Treasury Department can do what I call extraordinary income advances without creating real public debt. But at some point in time, they will have to because of the federal debt ceiling that is part of the law. And I'll get to that later. So in light of those issues and where we are today, I back up a little bit more and talk about our our Democratic presidential candidates. And I watched a skit that was on Saturday Night Live, and that skit was a parody of Elizabeth Warren, because part of her policy was to make Medicare available to everybody at a cost of $34 trillion. And so the skit was a question to the person who was portraying Elizabeth Warren: how do you pay for it? And the parody was, well, we're talking trillions. When the numbers are this big, they're just pretend. And that's kind of exactly part of our political persuasion today. The numbers are so big, people can't comprehend them. And programs like Bernie Sanders, Medicare for All, and other programs that had a price tag of $70 trillion. And, you know, Pete Buttigieg's climate trillion-dollar program, they're just not realistic spending programs, because we're not raising the revenue to pay for them. They sound good, but at some point in time, the bill comes due. So let's talk about where we really are today. I mentioned that the current, and there's a running clock out there about the current federal debt, and it's actually 26,148,192,222,078 those are big numbers. Like I said, that's $1 billion a day in interest payments. And that's a bill for every single American of $79,227. That's what we owe as taxpayers in our country for our federal deficit. The old argument used to be, well, that's not so bad if we have income, kind of like a bank. I come from banking. When you evaluate a credit, am I going to borrow people money? You look at their income. And the big number always was debt to income. The debt to income was healthy if you were under 40%, and you were a pretty good fair risk, credit risk. So how do you measure what the United States debt to income ratio is? Well, the way we measure income is our gross domestic product, because that measures the value of everything being created and produced and services supplied, and the income that's created in a given period of time in our country. Our current GDP is right around $21,540,000,000,000. So as you can see, with a debt of 26 trillion, an income, annual income of only 21 trillion, we have exceeded our income to debt ratio, and we're more like 106%. So our debt is right now, our federal debt is 106% of our income capacity. That's a problem, because that debt has to be paid eventually by somebody. And so we're leaving a huge debt burden to future generations. Our college kids and our young children, they're going to be faced with having to pay off this debt. So let's talk a little bit more about, we know about the government incentive to deal with the pandemic. They created a $2.4 trillion of more debt. However, in the last couple of years, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've increased our federal debt by $4 trillion, even in good times, when our revenues should have been exceeding our government spending programs, and they weren't. So let's talk about why the current debt is so high. So number one, obviously, the US government spends more than it takes in. So each year, its annual deficit adds to our federal debt. And the way that they pay for that debt is they borrow money. And they borrow money from the public. So we're borrowing money from public institutions, or from private institutions, pension funds, insurance funds, large investment banks, and foreign investment. Currently, China owns 8% of our outstanding federal debt. 8% of 26 trillion is a lot of money. So they could control our economy if they decided to unload that debt into the bond market. So that there's always that fear. So we rely heavily on foreign investment to pay for our debt, to borrow us money. The other negative thing about debt is that people that can afford to buy government bonds are people that have more than the people that have less. So when we create government programs and pay for government programs that exceed our debt, our tax revenue capacity, we're doing a huge wealth transfer, because it's the rich and the wealthy that absorb that portion of the debt, which is about $20 trillion is owned by the public, and at the disadvantage of lower income people who have to pay for the interest on that debt. So you're transferring income from lower and middle class people to higher and wealthier people who can afford to purchase that good sound debt of the US government. So we have this quiet wealth transfer, and again, a growing disparity between rich and poor, and between rich nations and poorer nations. So the annual budget of the government that is based on government spending and tax revenues currently is in a free fall, and it's creating trillions of dollars every year in additional federal debt because we're spending more than we're taking in. The tax cuts offered by the Trump administration that were supposed to increase tax revenues by creating better economic growth failed to cover the excessive spending of government. That's just part of the problem. So an easy solution is balanced budgets, in getting back to a position of government spending that can be afforded by tax revenues. We can talk a little bit about the tax revenue problem, in that we have a pretty unfair tax program right now. If you look at our 2019 tax revenues, we took in $3 trillion in tax revenue. 51% of that came from individual taxes. 35% came from payroll taxes, like Social Security and Medicare. 6%, only 6% came from corporate income tax. 3% came from excise taxes, and 1% came from estate and gift taxes. So the burden of our tax program, our tax policies, is specifically on the middle income taxpayers in our country. The 35% of payroll taxes, you'll know, are capped at a certain level of income, so that Social Security taxes shut off after you reach a certain income level. So again, you know where the burden of that tax revenue is. So one of the solutions is to make our tax program fair, redistribute, make our tax policies more progressive, and they're not that progressive. There is this term they call exemptions, deductions, credits, and preferential rates in our tax code, and we're losing $1.5 trillion a year to exemptions and deductions and credits and preferential rates that are embedded in our tax codes. And that one, if you look at who benefits from those deductions, exemptions, and credits, it's 51% of the taxpayers and the highest 20% of our individual taxpayers. So those exemptions that are built into our tax code specifically are the benefit of our highest paid and our highest income individuals, 51%. 18% is in our fourth quintile, or in our 80 to 90th percentile. So almost 70% of all of the deductions, exemptions, and tax credits that are allowed benefit our higher income earners in our society. So our tax system, our tax code, is definitely slanted to protect higher income at the expense of middle income and lower income people. So one of the solutions, one of the things that could be looked at is rewriting and rethinking our current tax code so that it's fairer and the burden is shifted to more and more higher income people. And we'll take a further look at that when we talk about this second, one of the second causes isn't just the revenue and tax code. One of the second causes is primarily we have an aging baby booming generation. And we have 10,000 people a day who are retiring, and adding to our growing rolls of our retiree class. And we have 78 million baby boomers. They'll all be retiring. So by 2030, 20% of all Americans will be 65 years of age or older. We're living longer today. Our average life expectancy is 79. Back in 1900s, that life expectancy was 47. And today, mothers are having less children, so we have less workers to support this retiring group like me. 1970, our median age in society, so the median age being half the people are under it and half the people are over it, was 28. Today, it's 38, and it's rising. So we have more and more seniors that are relying on fewer and fewer workers, and we old people, we're expensive. We're extremely expensive. Currently, people over 65 consume 40% of our federal budget. Let me bring that to again. People over 65 consume 40% of our federal budget. Social Security costs $900 billion a year. Medicare costs $600 billion a year. And 25% of Medicaid is consumed by seniors, and that's $125 billion a year. So we're expensive. We're very expensive. It's projected in the next decade, if the laws don't change and the benefits don't change, we will consume 50% of the federal budget, annual federal budget. So let's take a look at the benefits that we're consuming. Today's retirees collect 2 to 5 times what they have put into or their employers have contributed to, even considering interest added. So the money that I contributed to Social Security and Medicare, I'm receiving 2 to 5 times what I put in. That's why that number of 40% of the federal budget is growing. Medicare, people under 65 pay more than $2,000 a year in taxes to subsidize medical care for the elderly. So, and let's talk about the efficiency of the Medicare program. In comparison to other countries, we pay a lot more to support people over 65 than any of our countries that are on the same economic status as us, whether it's Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, France, Canada. On average, the healthcare cost in America per capita is $10,209. The highest of any of the OECD, the economically developed countries in the world, is Switzerland at $8,000, Germany at $5,700, Sweden at $5,500, France at $4,900, Canada at $4,800, Japan at $4,700, the Great Britain at $4,200, and Italy at $3,500. So we go to great lengths to preserve the health and welfare of our elderly population, and it's growing and it's growing. 30% of Medicare's budget, 30% of Medicare's budget of $600 billion goes to pay for patient care in the last year of their life. So, and then overall, the elderly over 65 benefits 5 to 20 times greater than what the payroll taxes that they paid into the program. So remember, Social Security and Medicare are paid for by payroll taxes. 30 years ago, 10% of the tax would support these programs, which that was what the payroll tax was, 10%. And that's including what employees put in plus matched by their employer. Today, the rate exceeds 15% of median wages. I think the employer the employee pays for Social Security something over 6% and right around 2% for Medicaid matched by the employer. So that's around 15% of payroll taxes goes to support Social Security and Medicare. So if these benefits stay as they are, the tax rate will have to raise to 25% in the next decade to support those programs. And if we don't change the benefit programs, then the payroll tax will need to rise to 40%. That's 20% by employee, 20% by employers by the year 2050. Those are daunting numbers. And in 1946, it took 42 workers to support one Social Security and Medicare retiree. We had that was the size of the workforce. So it was 42 workers to support one retiree. In 1960, it was 9 workers supporting one retiree. In 2020, it's 3 workers to support one retiree. In the year 2030, it's going to be down to, because of the size of the labor force, it's going to be down to 2 workers, which means that a working couple who's supporting a family also has to pay taxes to support one retiree. So those are the statistics. You can see the problem. And of course, from a political standpoint, nobody wants to deal with the problem. It's political suicide to talk about adjusting Social Security benefits, advancing potential retirement ages, or to raise payroll taxes. So those are some of the issues. So why is it difficult to deal with the problems? I just go back to 2004. This problem hasn't gone away, but in 2003, President Bush put in the most expansive entitlement program in 40 years. They offered up prescription care for all Medicare patients if they wanted it. Well, at the time, it seemed like a wonderful expansion of a entitlement program. The problem was it displaced coverage that a lot of retirees already had through other programs, and those programs disappeared. And pretty much today, most recipients are in the Medicare program, which initially was rolled out at a cost of $35 billion, and 5 months later, the cost escalated to $50 billion. In light of the fact that we have these alarming statistics about the cost of Social Security and Medicare, and our growing retiree base, and our shrinking labor force, we expanded programs because it was politically more advantageous. So 3 issues to deal with. Number 1, the cause is a worthy cause. Protecting the golden retirement age, it's worthy. It's hard to tell people, I'm going to take dramatic measures or reduced measures or increase taxes, eliminate programs to deal with the issue. Taking care of senior people who have been promised programs and benefits, it's socially unconscionable. So it's a problem. The cause is a worthy one to maintain these benefits. And the next one is the benefits are far more concentrated than the cost. For example, a retiree and his spouse who are collecting $32,000 a year in Social Security benefits and are collecting an additional $20,000 in Medicare benefits have greater incentive to maintain those benefits than the working couple who are only paying 15% of their, or actually not, are only paying 7% payroll tax to promise those benefits in the future. So the concentration of benefits offers incentive for you and me to continue to push our legislators to maintain these benefits and even maybe expand the benefits, versus the working family who is paying a lot less in taxes but doesn't realize the huge financial burden of all these benefits. So there is a disjointed, you and I have more incentive to maintain the benefits and to not have them reduced. And then the most important factor is, because we have these incentives, seniors vote at a far higher rate than any other age group in our population. And we vote for our self-interest, we vote for programs to be maintained, and we vote for benefits to be continued. So those are some of the issues with graying America. How we deal with them, that's a very, very touchy and very, very difficult issue. So we have healthcare concerns, we have a graying population, and we have a tax system that is progressively unfair in that you and I, the middle income taxpayers, we carry the burden of our tax programs, and the higher income people carry less of the burden. For instance, let's talk about Social Security. Social Security is available to everybody, regardless of whether you're Bill Gates or Joe Gentry. Regardless of what other income you might have come in, you can take advantage of your Social Security benefits, even though you may have income far greater than necessary to make those benefits really needed. So you can see we have some real issues in our society. And I don't want to say there aren't any solutions. There have been offered up lots of solutions, but it's endemic that we have legislators and elected officials who want to take this issue head on. Yeah, and I want to talk about why I think it's such a huge issue today, not just from the federal debt standpoint, but I want to talk about what has been done with the $8 trillion that have been added to the federal debt, partially due to reaction to the pandemic, in the recent $4 trillion that have been added by the recent tax cuts and over government spending in the last couple of years. I read some alarming numbers that talked about the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has indicated that Social Security and Medicare systems will collect $73 trillion in dedicated revenues, and they're going to spend $136 trillion, leaving a $63 trillion cash shortfall over the next 30 years. And assuming that we have to borrow to cover that shortfall, the $40 trillion in interest costs would raise the 30-year shortfall to an incomprehensible $103 trillion. Those are staggering numbers. And that's what's been estimated by the government's Congressional Budget Office. And they're a fairly conservative estimate. So those interest liabilities are going to create further economic disruption, because it's going to, again, separate the rich from the poor, from those that can borrow, lend the money to the government, and those that have to end up paying those taxes off. And we've been very fortunate in that we've been in a low interest environment. So the government, unlike you and I, who, if we had a mortgage, probably refinance to a low interest 30-year mortgage to take advantage of the low long-term rates, instead are borrowing money on the short term, which means that as interest rates go up, so will the interest burden of the debt, because as prime interest rates rise, that short-term borrowing interest rate goes up with that short-term rise. They don't have the foresight nor the gumption to lock in longer-term, slightly higher interest rates, but take advantage of the lowest short-term interest rates. And we know low interest rates are not going to be guaranteed for the immediate and long-term future. So government borrowing interest rates are going to go up. Our interest payable on our federal debt is going to significantly be increased. So let's talk a little bit about solutions. There have been some solutions. I'll offer up a bunch of websites and think tanks that have talked about some of the solutions to this problem. There is a wonderful foundation called the Peter Peterson Foundation. You can Google it. And it's all about bringing these think tank solutions to initiatives to talk about the truth about this federal debt issue that particularly politicians in are avoiding. And from my standpoint, to me, from a government economic issue, it's our number one issue, is what do we do to deal with this issue? Back in 2015, there was the Simpson-Bowles initiative that came out of Congress. It was a budget leader and Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson came together, and they put forth this initiative that had bipartisan support, but nobody acted on it, which had some great benchmark metrics. It laid out the fact that the government had to adjust the tax code to raise revenue, so that revenue ended up at 21% of GDP. The average currently is 17%. And reduce spending to 21% of GDP, which meant balanced budgeting. And then attempt to reduce programs to reduce the debt to 60% of GDP. And you know where it is today, it's at 106%. Reduce the tax rates, eliminate tax, remember, it said reduce tax rates, but eliminate tax deductions, credits, simplify the tax code while raising revenue through the tax code and reducing deficits. Curb the growth of defense spending and non-defense discretionary spending, which are public programs that are non-discretionary, and stabilize the Social Security finances by strengthening the safety net for seniors that have lower income. And I didn't talk a lot about defense spending, but part of that reduction that they offered up, let me see, I have some notes somewhere, talked about defense spending, that part of the problem with our defense spending is currently we spend, if you lump all of the major countries into a pie and you threw everybody's defense spending as the size of the pie, the United States spends 52% of all the defense spending in the world, and far greater than, and it doubles any other country, whether it's Russia, China, Japan, Germany, France, in defense spending. So one of the outcomes that we could look at is a way to improve is to modify our defense spending. we are pretty much no longer the world guardians when it comes to enforcing stuff worldwide. So defense spending definitely is one of the areas that we could seek improvement in our federal budget. Another initiative that was laid out was back in 2015 again, was the Pete Domenici, who was a senator, and Rivlin, who was a budget director from the CBO. They had a task force, and they came up with a comprehensive plan of tax and spending reforms. They wanted to stabilize federal deficit, or the federal debt to 60% of GDP. That was the goal. That's the same as the Simpson Bowles. They wanted to raise revenue to 21% of GDP. Also by eliminating deductions, exclusions, and preferences and credits, and then reduce spending to 23% of GDP. Freeze domestic, discretionary, and defense spending, and then moderate spending growth on healthcare, and then put Social Security in sustainable footing, increasing benefits for the lowest lifetime wage earners, and pairing them, cutting benefits for the top 25% of wage earners. So there have been significant bipartisan initiatives. However, none of them have ever made it past just word speak and never got adopted or accepted into any kind of law. The last thing I do want to talk about is the federal debt ceiling. When the government reaches the federal debt ceiling, and this is another part of the problem with our federal debt, they reach the federal debt ceiling, which means the Treasury Department can no longer borrow money. And if the Treasury Department can't borrow money, that means that programs like Social Security and Medicare, veterans benefits, can be delayed. They don't disappear. They could be pushed off and delayed. Spending for discretionary programs could be delayed. It's different than a government shutdown. It means that something has to happen to allow the Treasury Department to borrow money, because we're edging up on that debt ceiling. In August 2019, the federal debt ceiling was $18 trillion. It's at $26 trillion today. That's $8 trillion more than what the federal debt ceiling is. So what happened? In August of 2019, the Congress agreed to raise the spending levels, and they suspended the debt limit for 2 years. So that debt limit needs to be addressed in August of 2021. And they need to reinstate the debt limit to absorb all of the debt that was created since August of 2019. Approximately right now, $8 trillion, and it could be more. It's projected it could be upwards of $10 trillion. So that's a real issue. In the political arena that we have in a presidential election, senatorial election, to me, it seems prudent to ask candidates, how are you going to deal with the debt ceiling renewal? And what is your plan? And what are your policies to deal with this large federal debt, which exceeds our capacity to repay it? And how do you go forward? What are your initiatives. I think that's the point at where we are. And I think those are prudent questions because as from where I sit and from my experience, I see the federal debt. I see my kids, I'm leaving them a huge burden, a huge burden. It's not going to go away. That just can't be written off. It's not going away. Somebody has to repay it. And it's going to be for my kids, your children, to have to absorb that huge, huge debt. I will tell you there's a bunch of, I want to talk about institutes and websites that you can go to pique your interest. They're all think tanks, and they all deal with economic issues. They've actually all offered up solution initiatives on what policymakers should be considering to address the federal debt, to address current federal budget issues, to address the coronavirus pandemic economic issues. And I'd encourage you, if it interests you, to visit those websites. I'll just name them off. I'll make them available through AL so you can get them all. They're all pretty simple. If you've got a pen and paper in hand, the Center for American Progress is one. The Bipartisan Policy Center is another one. The Manhattan Institute, which is more devoted to peer economics, is another one. The American Enterprise Institute, the Economic Policy Institute, the Progressive Policy Institute, and the American Action Institute. All of these independent organizations came together under the 2019 Solutions Initiative put together by the Peter Peterson Foundation to provide for real solutions and real pathways for our elected officials and you and I voters to be holding those officials accountable to. I'd encourage you to visit. Some of them are more conservative, some of them are more liberal, but they all offer up solutions to what I see is a real growing issue. With that, take a break and we can open this up for discussion. I'd entertain any questions or any discussion that we might have. So, Susan, if you want to unmute.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to unmute everyone. And we have a question that has been asked by someone. Let's see. I'm just going to ask everybody to unmute their mic if they want to ask a question. The question came in earlier as to how much of the amount paid in the U.S. for health care for the elderly over what is paid in other countries results from higher drug, physician, hospital, and insurance cost. And that's the only one I've got in the chat. So everything else we can do through.
Yeah, I saw that. I can offer a few numbers. I talked about the healthcare cost per capita, which is the cost. It's the cost of drug, physician, hospital, insurance costs. In the United States, our healthcare cost per capita is $10,209. Switzerland is the next highest at $8,900. If you compare it to Canada, it's $4,826. Japan, $4,717. Great Britain's $4,264. And you understand a lot of those are social democracies that have more universal healthcare systems, unlike the United States, which is still pretty much a market-driven system. But here's some other numbers that are interesting. There are listed on one of those wonderful websites or those institutes that I listed. If you go to the Peter Peterson Foundation, I do have a beautiful slide on healthcare from Peter Peterson that talks about outcomes. And they talked about, even though the United States spends more money per capita, we're in the lowest quartile of outcomes. And the outcomes being recovery from diabetes treatment, early childhood diseases, infant mortality. They have all these outcomes. And on every outcome, the United States ranks in the lowest quartile. And so even though we're spending lots of money, we're not getting effective results. The Institute of Medicine predicts that 30% of our medical spending in this country is unnecessary, ineffective, overpaid, and wasteful. That's $765 billion. That's more than we spend on K through 12 education. Wasteful, ineffective, overpriced. Those are the numbers. And you're right. Our healthcare costs are very, very. One of the alarming statistics, and I don't say this that I don't take a side on this, but it's just a number. One of the numbers that came through one of those institutes was people over 65 routinely can have heart transplants and bypass surgery. Typical bypass surgery costs $80,000. We're the only country in the free world, really, in all these other social democratic healthcare for everybody countries. Once you hit that 65 age group, those expensive surgeries are no longer covered. Same with dialysis. In Great Britain, if you're over 55, they don't cover dialysis treatment. So there's hard decisions. In the United States, we care for people. We spend our healthcare dollars, preserve life right up to the last breath. And that is a moral decision that every individual, I think, has to make. I'm not sure how you deal with that on a democratic political level, but that's our reality. And that has driven our costs up.
Okay, so if we've got questions, just unmute your mic and I'll open it up and let anybody ask a question of Joe they'd like to right now.
Joe,
Hey, Mike.
haven't we been taught that continual deficit spending by the government will trigger inflation? And if that is true, why has that not happened in a big way?
Oh, boy. Well, the definition always is too few dollars chasing too much goods and services. Inflation always used to be understood by the Federal Reserve that you either make money available or you don't make money available. It's the amount of money that's chasing the capacity of production. And if you shrink the amount of money available, and that kind of the old tools of the Federal Reserve being able to deal with inflation, or inflation meaning you and I just are demanding more and more goods and services and we have less and less dollars, so you just kind of expand the dollars to make sure prices stay stable. Hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. And partly it's because not so much the success of the United States, but it's the failure of a lot of other economies. And so the demand for US dollars on foreign markets has stayed consistently high, which keeps interest rates, the Fed able to keep interest rates low. And so you don't get inflation. But that will turn. It's surprising to me, with unemployment rates running in the 20%, that we haven't seen a spike in prices overall. I mean, in certain areas, but not overall. We saw toilet paper, prices go up. We saw meat go up. Holy cow! Meat prices went, almost unaffordable. But then look what happened to gas prices. It's all supply and demand.
Yeah.
You know, Saudi Arabia wouldn't turn off the oil, and you know, gas prices dropped down under $2, the lowest in decades. And of course, people didn't have any demand for oil because they weren't traveling, the industry wasn't running. The prices even continued to drop, even when Saudi Arabia moderated the amount of oil they were dumping in the market. So it's still, inflation still comes back to supply and demand issues. And that's kind of why inflation hasn't happened. I think it will once the economy rebounds. I see it. I see people spending money today. This is a personal observation, is that I think the economy will rebound quicker than it did from the recession. I'm not going to say real fast, but if you remember the recession, the Great Recession, they call it the banking thing here 10 years ago, it took about a decade to recoup all that. I think it'll be quicker. I think there's pent-up demand. I think people have, they want to spend money, and spending drives the economy. We just got to keep the government from spending money.
So
I don't know if that's going to happen.
yeah, having spent some years in the government, that's going to be hard to do. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, Tom Hilberg. And then Joe, you you didn't mention our infrastructure is sadly been ignored, and I don't even know where to start with how much money you would need. Roads. We just passed a huge school bond here. Many school districts are in the same shape as us. In Midland, those dams collapsed. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, and I don't even know what you could put trillions on that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And and that's all discretionary spending, and that's all discretionary spending from the federal government. And they've kind of washed their hands and pushed it back to the states, which the states are in just as big a trouble as at least our state has to put in balanced budgets. I wish that was the case in the federal level. Unfortunately, it's not. And one of the incentive to deal with the pandemic that I see being proposed is huge infrastructure spending. There's lots of negative on that, lots of positive. I was on a call yesterday with Gary Peters' office for an hour and a half, and we were talking about just these same kind of issues through our United Way Association. They were talking about some of the program initiatives that we have, and it's all discretionary spending, like the earned income tax credit for low-income people, and issues like that. More Medicare low-income advances to the state so that the states can maintain those social programs. And they touched on one of the hot button issues right now, particularly in the Senate, in the second incentive program, is infrastructure spending. Trump he would love to do that, a huge infrastructure spending program. I had a conversation with my neighbor who is the assistant director of the water plant, and we were talking about their clear water pipes that they have, and he goes, "Well, Joe, those clear water pipes were installed in 1926." And he said, and the intake valves, they were in 1933, and we're at our capacity. He said, there's lots of things we could do. And he says, we're looking for a $1.3 million grant to expand and replace those. We're high on the list, but so is everybody else that has the same infrastructures that were put in during the 20s. I don't know what the answer is, but I have a terrible feeling that the federal government's just going to slide this to the states and say, you deal with it. We have other issues, and you're going to have to deal with your own statewide infrastructure programs. And that, to me, I don't know if that's the answer either. So I could see taking a lot of defense spending and and putting that toward infrastructure. If you look at the defense budget, I mean, compared to what other countries have, it's almost obscene. You know, it's twice as big as anybody else's. Do we have the need for, and it's not military, just military spending. It's all the stuff that goes with the military, from boats to, or from vessels to airplanes to facilities. It's not just the wage earning of the military people. So some of those websites, I think if you go to the Manhattan Institute, they have all kinds of initiatives on how to fix our failing rundown infrastructure. And I think that's a good place to start.
Okay. Any more questions?
Joe, do you have any idea what percentage of the cost of Medicare is, or what if we instituted, like many countries have, a price fixing or price ceiling maybe on drugs? That's a big issue.
Just on prescriptions alone, I'm not. Let me look. I know the current cost is 50 billion, just on the prescription side of Medicare. And I, totally agree with you on the absorbent cost for free market prescription drugs that are protected by seven-year market protection because of the development cost. And yeah, we're way behind the rest of the world in controlling prescription costs. But more specific numbers, Jerry, I don't have. I know that the cost was estimated at 35 billion. It's now up over 50 billion a year. Just in Medicare. Now, and that, in 2018, that 50 went to 59 billion. And 2019 numbers aren't available yet. The $59 million just for prescription costs under Medicare.
Well, that's good, thanks. But I mean, something I think needs to be looked at. They talk about it, but do nothing.
Yeah, I know it. And those are issues. I mean, those are the kind of issues that you reach out to Debbie Stabenow, Gary Peters, and our elected legislators, and ask them what their plan is. I know it seems too much of their attention is focused on pandemic stuff right now, but the federal budget, I worry what's going to happen in August 2021 with the federal debt ceiling. They better absorb $8 trillion more of debt and push that debt ceiling up. And that's significant. That's going forward, we got to figure. Remember in the 90s, we actually ran a couple of years of surplus.
I know.
Annual budget surpluses. It didn't take long to fall back to our old ways of more spending than revenue coming in. No. Back in the days when I was more conservative than I am today, and was more Republican than I am today. I remember when Jim Blanchard was running for governor of Michigan, and the state was in horrible financial situation. And that horrible financial situation was our bond grading had declined from like AA to B+. I mean, we were paying at the time exorbitant interest rates to finance government programs in the state. And Governor Blanchard, or at that time, Democratic hopeful Blanchard, proposed an income tax increase. And it was significant, like 2.25% increase to, and remember, in the state of Michigan, we're bound by the law. We can't have a progressive flat tax rate. We have, by law, has to be a flat tax rate, which is hugely regressive because 4% of $100,000 income certainly is harder to, is less hard on someone who's making $15,000 a year and they're paying 4%. But anyway, so he ran on raising the income tax by 2.25% to solve the deficit issue and the debt issue we had in Michigan. But he also ran with the promise that once that debt issue was solved, he was going to roll back that income increase so that when we were in a balanced budget, it would return to the 4% level, and that, or whatever level it was at the time, and spending would come in line with that 4%. And by God, he did it. He got elected by running on a tax increase and also eliminating a whole bunch of discretionary spending programs that seemed to be non-productive in the state. But he did it. And when we successfully got to a balanced budget, he rolled back those income tax credits. I think it takes today, from where I sit, elected officials that have the same kind of chutzpah, same kind of foresight to see we have issues and problems that need to be solved and can take the unpleasant, quote, the unconscionable electable position that we have to freeze programs, we have to raise taxes, we have to stabilize the program however we can, whether it's Social Security or Medicare. We need to address these issues. Some of these are going to be hard issues, but they need to be done. And when we get there, then we can move back to maybe where we were. It's been done. It had been done effectively in Michigan, you know. Actually, I became a huge proponent of Jim Blanchard because he took the problem head on and got elected on a platform nobody's going to run on. I will raise taxes. So I mean,
Joe,
yeah.
In freezing, you recommend freezing programs, and I agree. There are many programs out there that need to be frozen, and anybody that's running on a platform that says they're going to freeze those programs or eliminate them or whatever they're going to do to try to get the balanced budget. What happens is the lobbyists step in, and the movement to prohibit that from happening happens, and sometimes our legislators get railroaded and they can't do what they said they were going to do because of outsized forces. Do you agree or not agree?
Oh, I agree. There's an excellent it's maybe a future presentation. There's excellent discussion out there, and there's a guy who wrote who actually made a whole course at Georgetown, and it's called The Economics of Politics. And I'm trying to think of the economist's name, but it was one of the most popular courses on campus. And he, it basically starts out and he says, unfortunately, elected officials run to get reelected. And the minute they're in office, it's all about being reelected. And the public policy issues and representing the public that you've been elected to become secondary. And all of a sudden you do what you have to do to stay in office and be reelected. And there's all these examples and all these issues and stuff that goes along with this course, and it's fascinating. And I think you're right, Susan. I had attended a legislative meeting, and one thing that I got out of it was legislators take heed. They listen to who writes them, who calls them, who takes the time to talk to them about issues just as much as they do lobbyists. I said, the automatic generated, sign my name to this from your association does not get the attention when I get an email from Joe or when I get a phone call from Joe. And yeah, it might be my staffer, but we pay more attention to the individual who contacts us regarding an issue than we do the automatic generated issue letters, because those are coming from, quote, the same kind of lobbyists that you're trying to fight against. So I've kind of made it my point on a personal level. When there's issues or something I feel important about, I shoot off take the time to deliver an email or telephone call. And, I've got to know most of the staffers of our elected officials. And it's interesting because I did that to the governor. I sent the governor, and this is just a personal opinion. I sent the governor when she was getting a lot of flack about the stay-at-home orders. And I consider myself in that risk because I'm over 60. And I have a mother-in-law who's 80. And so I took it pretty serious. And so did my spouse, my bride, very serious. And about the stay-at-home orders and wearing masks and social distancing. And I sent her an email personally. And I just said, I support you. Even though you've released our neck of the woods because we have low cases, and I want to tell you, you're on the right path. You're doing the right thing to level this curve in the pandemic. So hang in there. All the protests and all that, I said, they're not very foresighted and they don't care about me, but I care about them. And I'm going to wear my mask and I'm not going to a crowd gathering. I'm not doing this, so stay in there. So she sent me back a form letter from one of her staffers that wasn't about the pandemic. It was about hospital funding in rural areas. And they had tried to cut and paste. I was so offended. I steamed on it for a couple of days. And so I sent back a personal handwritten letter. And I said, obviously, mine wasn't a generated email. I said, I appreciate the fact that you're answering me, but it wasn't the issue I was dealing with. I was congratulating you and telling you to continue down the path you were continuing down. I didn't contact you regarding rural hospital. About a week later, I got a personal call from her head of constituent advocacy. And she apologized. And I got to know her, and it was interesting because when she called me, I recognized her name, and I said, you're not the daughter of Deb Rumrill, are you? There's a long pause, and she said, that's my mother. I said, I worked with your mother at M-Bank when she was in Manistee, and she talked very highly about you. She says, I promise you, Joe, that you're on our to listen to list now. She said, and we thank you for that letter. That was a staffer who had been on the job for 2 days. We had such an overflow of communications. she just was trying to respond quickly, and that will never happen again. So if you ever have any, you personally contact me. And I thought, well, at least I have a personal contact in the governor's office. I have a programmer issue. And so, I think you can't sit on your hands. Unfortunately, we as citizens just can't sit on our hands. This is an issue that's important to me. I've reached out to Stamus, I've reached out to Stabino, and I reached out to Peters about it. They know who I am, and I continue to reach out to them. And it's about those issues and about those initiatives. And hopefully it has some kind of influence on the actions, what they're going to do to preserve the future for my kids. That's what I'm concerned about, the future for my kids. I do not want them burdened with this huge interest payments.
So any more questions? Okay. Well, Joe, I think you've generated a lot of discussion and you've given us a lot of great resources to follow up with. I do want to note that this session's been recorded and in a day or so will be available on the Association of Lifelong Learners YouTube site. So if you want to go back and listen to it again and maybe catch some of the sites that Joe talked about, you can do that. Or encourage others to listen to it also that weren't able to get on today. But Joe, I know that you're really busy at the United Way, and we sincerely appreciate you taking your time to do this presentation today. And I think there's a lot more for discussion in this topic.
I want to give a pitch to anybody who's still on out there. At the start of this pandemic, the United Way was graciously the recipients of some corporate donations to an established emergency fund to help those agencies on the front line meeting the needs of our community, whether they needed PPEs or they were doing pop-up pantries, or they needed to fill their food pantries, or they were still doing meals on Sunday supper or the Friendship Room. Or motel and hotel vouchers for homeless people that NEMSCA and Hope Shores Alliance was delivering. And we had some very generous local donors. And I'm not asking for donations. I'm asking you, if you know of agencies or you're involved in organizations that have needs that you're helping to meet the immediate emergency needs, whether it's food, shelter, personal hygiene, office co-pays, office visit pays. I know that that if you're doing telemedicine, the co-pays aren't covered the same as if you go to an office visit. And so some of our lower income people, middle income people are getting hit with some co-pays that might necessarily not put them in a healthy financial situation. We still have money left in our emergency response fund, and we want to make it available to help meet the needs. Unfortunately, we don't give it directly to individuals, but we try to find the agencies that can help meet the needs. I know when the governor's orders that eliminates eviction notices and eliminates shut-off notices, there is going to be a tsunami of need to help people with power bills, utility bills, heating bills, or rent payments. So we do have resources available, and I want to help the people in our community. So that's just a quick advertisement for us to let you know that we have resources available if you know of agencies that have needs.
Well, thank you. That's great. That's great news. It's nice to know how the United Way is serving our community directly.
So far, we've given out $35,000. I'd like to make it $55,000. So.
Well, listen, we thank you again, and we'll hopefully see another topic from you in the future, Joe.
Okay. Well, thank you. I enjoyed this.
Then go back. Joe, is there a way you can publish the websites I couldn't write them down fast.
Joe?
Yes.
Joe, can you send a list of those websites to Dick Bremer, and Dick can get those out to the participants?
I will do that.
All right.
Just send them to the all office address.
Okay. Can do.
Thank
All
you.
right.
All
Perfect.
right.
Thanks
Very
so
good.
much. We'll go ahead
Thanks.
and we'll end the session now. And thanks a lot.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
You too.